Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Henry again, coming at you with another video lecture for the week of May 11th through May 17th on political revolutions. This is the very first one. We talked about kind of an introduction to revolutions last week with the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the Enlightenment, and now we're doing physical or political revolutions and how the Enlightenment heavily influenced them. And I'm going to be talking about the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. You'll go deeper into the American Revolution in your American history classes later on, or AP US history classes. So really just talking about the Enlightenment's impact and a little bit of history of the American Revolution. So you need to have the Enlightenment and American Revolution handout to follow along. And let's get started. So to just kind of introduce everything, we need to understand there was a big change in thought with how people viewed government and society. Now, the Enlightenment, which started in Europe, heavily centered in France with the philosophes, it spreads throughout Europe, but also it spreads to the Americas. The ideas like natural laws, life, liberty, and property from John Locke and other ideas like government should reflect the natural laws and should encourage education, debate, and support those natural laws. Government should be open to negotiation. They shouldn't just be tyrannical and just impose their will. And using reason and intelligence, you can improve your life and society and government. So those are some of the ways that people are thinking now when it comes to government and society. And these are in the back, this is always in the background of kind of the American Revolution. And now some background info on like some things that led to the kind of separation between the American colonists in England. Um, Colonies in England are separated by an entire ocean, if you didn't know that. Hopefully you did. And this hurts communication. It takes quite a bit of time to send letters back and forth. So communication between the English crown and the colonists, or Parliament and the colonists, is slim to none. There's also cultural separation on top of the physical. The colonies have been around for 150 years by now. They've been ruling themselves mainly. They developed a relatively large population, and many of them didn't view themselves as being English anymore. They identify with their colony more than anything else. So it's not I'm an Englishman, I'm a Rhode Islander, or I'm a North Carolinian, or a Floridian. Ugh. I don't even think Florida was one of the originals. I don't know. But either way, um, but you get what I'm saying. People identified with their colony more than they did with England. I mean, like that. Another thing that kind of led to the American Revolution is the French and Indian War. This was a war between the British or the English and the French, who were allied with the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples of the America. So you have the French and the Native Americans versus the English. And the English win, but it's kind of a hollow victory because they do get pretty much control of all of like the American colonies, and France is pushed pretty much just into Canada. It does put them into a great deal of debt, about 122 million British pounds, and you can look up how much that is on your time. I personally do not know the exchange, but England wanted the colonies to pay that off, and so they put forward various taxes and laws that were meant to force that. Stamp Act, which was a tax for a stamp on any kind of paper or official document. The Quartering Act, the Intolerable Act, which took rights away from some of the citizens, from the colonists. And of course, the colonists themselves objected that harsh treatment, and that kind of gets the American Revolution started. Um, and of course, eventually you have the separation from England um, with the Declaration of Independence. Authors from like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin were the primary authors. A list of complaints and grievances about England. It also lists the various natural rights that all citizens have. And the main idea is all men are born equal. Countries have the right to overthrow the government. Government should protect our rights, or specifically our natural rights, or what we call them our unalienable rights. It is basically a document filled with Enlightenment rhetoric and philosophy. That's pretty much what the Declaration of Independence is. And eventually, of course, the war starts, and there are early struggles for the Americans in the beginning. Lack of money, lack of supplies, lack of training, honestly. But the turning point is when we make an alliance with the French, who are very unhappy about losing the French and Indian War, and this will come back to bite the French later on in their revolution, which you'll see, which we'll get there. But they provide money, armies, and a navy to aid us, to aid the colonists in the American Revolution. And eventually, of course, the war ends in 1781 when the British surrender. And once that happens, we lead to the formation of the American government. And the very first government that is formed is the Articles of Confederation. So the current government we have now is not our first government. Our first government was created by the Articles of Confederation. And it was pretty much meant to enforce state rights or state power and not federal power, because the colonists feared a very strong central government or a very strong federal government, as it would be too controlling and remind them too much of a monarchy. So the Articles of Federation make the states extremely powerful, but it weakens the federal government. But that created a bunch of issues, like the federal government couldn't raise taxes. They weren't able to negotiate with other countries. They couldn't have an official national army, and so there was also very little national money. And so they eventually have to change the government into what we have now, which is created by the U.S. Constitution, which gives power to the federal government over state governments. And it creates the federal system, which has our three branches, which we can hark all the way back to Montesquieu, of course, and even take it all the way from Montesquieu back to the Romans, the Roman Republic. And we have the executive, legislative, and judicial branch, and you have the Bill of Rights, which was put forth by people who really feared a strong federal government, and it was meant to protect the rights and promise equality and due process of law. Okay, and so for the final part we have is the Enlightenment versus the U.S. Revolution. This is kind of your main assignment. So before we jump into this, just to kind of recap on some of the philosophers, of course, we have John Locke, who put forth natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Government is supposed to protect those rights. If it doesn't, you can overthrow the government. You have Rousseau, who was a big proponent of equality, and he favored a direct democracy because that seems to be the most equal way. But he is a very big supporter of equality. Inequality in any form is bad. Rousseau also believed that people were born naturally good and that society corrupts people. Then you have Montesquieu, who was the big idea behind separation of powers or checks and balances even, and having a branch system of government because power corrupts. So you split that power to limit that corruption. You have Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a big proponent of women's rights and equality between men and women, especially when it comes to education. Um, and Voltaire, who was a big supporter of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And then finally, there was Thomas Hobbes, of course, who supported a strong power figure like an absolute monarch, because he believed people were born evil, and that was meant, and a strong governmental figure could scare them straight into behaving. So you need to keep that in mind when going forward into this assignment, which is the Enlightenment versus the U.S. Revolution. So what you'll do is, step one, read the passage from the document from U.S. history. It'll be things like the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, lines from the Constitution, the preamble, things like that. Then you'll determine which thinkers influence the document, and you can underline and label the sections. I recommend looking at your chart on the Enlightenment thinkers to help you. And then you also explain in which way those thinkers are present and explain why. So you can write their name where it has a thinker and then explain how they relate. And then finally, you'll complete response on the bottom of the page, which is which thinker or thinkers were the most influential. And of course, you have to explain why. Think of it like a quick write, which is 5 sentences. You put your argument statement, evidence, and support evidence. You know the deal. We'll do the very first one together, and then we'll go from there. And we'll do part of the first one together anyway, so I can show you how it's kind of done. So you should have scrolled down, be on the last page of their Enlightenment American Revolution handout. You should be looking at the very first document, Document 1, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes obstructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So, which one of the philosophers do you think influenced this document? Want to do like do the explore? I'm pointing at you. That's right, students. All right, well, whatever. But you should obviously be able to pick out John Locke from this. That is one of the philosophers. I said explorers earlier, my mistake. One of the philosophers. There are two ways you can reference it. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That is similar to his natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Kind of like that. So I would put John Locke's name under which of the philosophers do you think influenced this document? 2 to 3, which means you need to have 2 to 3 philosophers. It says 2 to 3. Don't just put one and keep it moving. Find another one. And explain how. John Locke believed in natural rights and the Declaration of Independence. It speaks of unalienable rights, which are basically the same thing, just like that. So go ahead, make sure you write your work to the best of your ability, and talk to you later.